At the end of the last century, Alexander Karelin absolutely petrified heavyweights across the wrestling world.
Alexander Karelin, who is the scariest fucking wrestler of all time. Like, if anybody says, like, who's the scariest wrestler of all time, it's Karelin.
This Siberian monster went undefeated for 13 straight years and even dipped his toes into MMA waters. Americans dubbed him the Madman for his insane training methods and the Experiment for possessing what seemed like superhuman strength. The Russian Bear's dominance became so overwhelming that wrestling authorities were forced to change the actual rules just to give his opponents a fighting chance. Today we're stepping into the world of one of the most terrifying athletes to ever compete, a man who redefined what it meant to be feared in sports. Deep in the frozen heart of Siberia, something monstrous was taking shape. Alexander Karelin was born into an industrial city where his tiny parents, neither taller than 5'5", had no idea they'd created a genetic freak. Weighing a massive 12 pounds at birth, this wasn't your average baby. By 12 years old, the kid towered over his own father and tipped the scales at 176 pounds. When 15-year-old Alexander walked into that Greco-Roman wrestling gym in 1981, it was like destiny calling. Not even a brutal leg fracture that should have ended his career could stop him. His desperate mother actually burned his wrestling uniform, begging him to quit before the sport consumed him completely. But nothing could pull this giant away from his chosen path. By 1988, the 20-year-old monster was ready to announce himself to the world. At the Soviet Union Championship, Alexander bulldozed through the entire bracket despite suffering a concussion that would have hospitalized normal humans. The final showdown put him face-to-face with two-time world champion Igor Rostoratsky, the only man who had ever beaten him. What happened next was pure savagery. Karelin grabbed his opponent's waist, lifted all he knew, 260 pounds of the champion like he was picking up a child, and launched him through the air in what would become his signature move. The wrestling world had never seen anything like the Karelin lift, but this was just the beginning. At the Seoul Olympics that same year, heavyweight wrestlers got their first taste of true Siberian terror. The young giant moved with shocking cat-like speed for his massive frame, obliterating everything in his path. Not a single opponent lasted the full distance on his march to gold.
He's been the man for 13 years. Nobody's even had a chance to beat him. Actually, he picked me up 3 times and threw me on my head. My feet almost hit the back of my head.
In the final against 4-time world medalist Rangel Gorovsky, things got dangerous when the crafty Bulgarian actually scored first, stunning everyone. But when an angry Karelin finally unleashed his full power, spinning 280 pounds of human flesh like a tornado, the outcome was inevitable. At just 20 years old, he'd become the youngest Olympic heavyweight champion in history. The wrestling world was about to witness total domination.
Поэтому ничего вроде попытки вскинуть руки, пробежаться, впитать триумф, насладиться этим моментом у меня не было тогда.
The king now had to defend his throne, and what followed was 3 years of complete annihilation. From 1989 to 1991, Karelin turned wrestling into his personal torture chamber. When the mightiest heavyweights tied up with him, they instantly looked like children next to their father. Every single match ended the same way, his opponents flying through the air courtesy of that terrifying reverse body lift. 3 consecutive European titles, 3 world championships, and not one opponent could survive the full distance. By 1992, the Soviet Union had collapsed, but Karelin's reign of terror was just getting started. At the Barcelona Olympics, he carried the unified team's flag as the undisputed favorite. Every top wrestler had spent years preparing specifically for him, but preparation meant nothing against this freak of nature. The entire tournament lasted just 7 minutes for Alexander. Western journalists had run out of words to describe what they were witnessing. The Russian Bear seemed too tame, so they settled on something that perfectly captured the horror, the Experiment. Grown men seriously believed scientists had created this monster in some secret laboratory. How else could you explain a 6'3", 100-pound destroyer born to parents who barely reached 5'5"?
It's Karelin. They used to call him the Experiment because his parents were like normal size, like kind of tiny, like 5'7", and he's a fucking panther, like a human panther.
In the gold medal match, former world champion Thomas Johansson from Sweden lasted mere seconds before getting pinned. Karelin didn't just beat his opponents, he made them question their life choices. But the most terrifying part wasn't his victories. It was how effortless they looked.
Все это раскованно и все уверенно, и у всех там выиграл, поэтому стал 2-кратным чемпионом Олимпийских игр.
Even conquering everything wasn't enough for this machine. Two-time Olympic champion refused to skip a single tournament, relentlessly expanding his collection of victims who experienced involuntary flight. But his insane schedule finally caught up with him at the 1993 World Championship when Alexander fractured 2 ribs in the opening match. With no team doctor and 0 painkillers, most athletes would have withdrawn, not Karelin. Opponents sensed blood in the water, thinking this was their chance to finally dethrone the monster. They were dead wrong. Fighting through agony that would have crippled ordinary men, the injured giant systematically destroyed every challenger, sealing gold in the first period of the final. His body was screaming for mercy, but Alexander's will was unbreakable. However, years of punishment eventually demanded payment. Just months before the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, disaster struck. His major pectoralis muscle completely tore away from the bone. Doctors told him he wouldn't be able to lift a spoon for a year, let alone compete at the highest level.
У меня оторвалась большая грудная мышца. Врачи сказали о том, что я не смогу через год правой рукой поднимать ложку.
The smart move would have been to retire. Instead, Karelin declared he was going to his 3rd Olympics no matter what. Training became limited, sparring was forbidden, and his signature Karelin lift was now impossible to execute. For the first time in years, Alexander looked vulnerable. In Atlanta, the wrestling world held its breath as the wounded bear faced America's Matt Ghaffari in front of a hostile crowd that wanted nothing more than to see their hero slay the Russian monster. The arena erupted as Rocky IV music blasted, but when the dust settled, it was still Karelin's hand being raised. Even broken and operating at maybe 70% capacity, he was still untouchable. At 28, Alexander had claimed his 3rd Olympic gold and cemented his status as an immortal legend. But the most shocking chapter of his story was still to come. Following his Atlanta triumph, the madman refused to slow down, defending his heavyweight crown with maniacal intensity. Over the next 3 years, he lapped the field so thoroughly that opponents couldn't score a single point against him for 6 straight years. When Karelin faced Ghaffari again in the 1998 World Championship final, the American lasted just minutes before getting destroyed. The Russian bear had turned wrestling into his personal playground of pain. But then something unexpected happened. Karelin's fame transcended wrestling entirely. In 1999, while supporting friends at an MMA event in Japan, a cocky local fighter named Akira Maeda boldly challenged the wrestling legend to a mixed rules fight.
Он пришел и что-то обидное посредством переводчика вот говорил мне в лицо, но я не в японском не спец, и я-то думал, что он просто это как особенность артикуляции, когда слюни летят так далеко. А он что-то там рычал. Потом я понял, что он обозвал и меня, и наших предшественников.
Maeda was no joke. A pro wrestling star with 12 MMA fights under his belt, including submission victories over legitimate grapplers. While Akira spent 6 months in America training with freestyle specialists, Karelin made 0 changes to his routine. The rules were simple. Only open palm strikes allowed, no ground and pound. What happened next was terrifying. When Maeda started landing painful leg kicks, Karelin's eyes went dark. The gentle giant disappeared, replaced by something primal.
Ударил меня по ноге характерными приемами из вот этих ударных техник. Лоу-кики это у них называется. Вот. Я понял, что больно достаточно.
Alexander grabbed the striker, launched him through the air with a devastating front headlock throw, then methodically squeezed him with what looked like an arm triangle until the bell saved Maeda's life. For 10 minutes, the Russian bear systematically tortured his opponent without throwing a single strike, yet Maeda still couldn't walk out under his own power. Karelin donated his $1 million purse to the Russian Wrestling Federation and returned to his wrestling dominance. But this glimpse into MMA proved one thing. The monster was truly unstoppable across all combat sports. By 2000, Alexander had become a 13-time national champion and 11-time European champion, earning his shot at Olympic immortality in Sydney. At 33, with a dozen broken ribs accumulated over the years, he announced this would be his farewell performance. The wrestling world prepared to witness history as Karelin aimed to become the first wrestler ever to capture 4 Olympic golds. He bulldozed through the bracket without conceding a single point, looking every bit the invincible force that had terrorized the sport for over a decade. But lurking in the shadows was a rule change that would prove catastrophic. Wrestling officials had modified the overtime procedure. If wrestlers were tied after regulation, they'd be placed in an over-under clinch, and whoever released their grip first would be penalized a point. Standing between Karelin and immortality was Rulon Gardner, a massive farm boy from Wyoming with a 56-inch chest and absolutely nothing to lose. For 2 periods, both men battled to a scoreless draw, something that hadn't happened to Karelin in years. When they were forced into the dreaded clinch position, fatigue and 13 years of punishment finally caught up to the Russian bear. Alexander's legendary grip, the same hands that had lifted countless opponents into orbit, betrayed him. He released first, 1 point to Gardner. For the first time in over a decade, Karelin found himself trailing and desperately chasing the match. His signature moves failed him, his superhuman strength wasn't enough, and when the final buzzer sounded, the impossible had happened. Alexander Karelin, the most dominant athlete in sports history, had lost. The wrestling world didn't just witness an upset, they watched the death of a god.
Вот, и я проиграл. Я не научился это комментировать до сих пор.
Karelin's reign of terror was over, ended not by superior skill or strength, but by a rule specifically designed to dethrone him. The irony was crushing. After forcing wrestling to change its rules because of his dominance, those very rule changes ultimately destroyed him. Within months, the over-under clinch rule was abolished, but it was too late. The monster had been slain, and Alexander Karelin walked away from wrestling forever, leaving behind a legacy of pure terror that will never be matched.
He's been the man for 13 years. Nobody's even had a chance to beat him. Actually, he picked me up 3 times and threw me on my head. My feet almost hit the back of my head.
Unbeaten for 13 years, Karelin stacked up titles that felt impossible. A place in the Guinness World Records and the International Wrestling Federation's pick for the greatest wrestler of the 20th century. 2 decades later, plenty of his feats are still unmatched. His journey tells every young person, even from the most isolated places, you can become a champion. If you enjoyed this, leave a like, subscribe, and show your support for the sport.